Okay, today I'm going to show you some rendering hacks to get the best finish when you're doing your own rendering. I've got two worlds to work on here, and basically we're just applying a top coat directly onto the scratch. I've sprayed the walls down a little bit. Here's the first rule of thumb: no matter when you're applying render, whether it's onto brick, concrete blocks or the scratch coat, always give the walls a light spray down with water first, just so the walls have got something to grip to, and it just stops the render from drying out completely. So all we're doing is just applying the top coat to the scratch. And one of the biggest things we've got to talk about straight away is to not play with the render. So as soon as you put it on, just try and leave it. Don't worry about getting it flat. It's not like plastering where we're flattening it with the trowel. I'm going to show you in this video the exact tools we use for it, but it's not about getting your walls flat with your trowel or rendering. You just literally want to apply it, give it a quick flatten, and then leave it. So we're just literally putting it on nice and thick. But here's the other thing we've got to avoid doing. You never really want to put too much render on in one coat. At the back wall, we've got a little apprentice dude there. He's not mine, he's my mate's little apprentice. I've just asked him to scratch up the render. Basically, that back wall is so bellied out that we've got to apply a quick coat of render. I've got to wait for it to dry, and then I've got to apply another coat just to try and get it level. So at the beginning, we've just got to do it in stages. You never want to put too much render on in one go. So what happens is you'll apply the render, everything looks alright, but then when you start to play with it or rule it off to get it flat, what happens, it can sag, and then the whole thing will come off. That's actually what has happened a few times. So what you want to avoid doing is putting too much render on in one sitting. So you just you want to be aiming for about 15mm total thickness. So about 7 to 8mm on a scratch coat, same again for the top. And all you're doing is literally just whacking it on. Like I said, we're not flattening it with trowel. You don't want to get it perfect, don't want to play with it too much. Using you just put it on with, and the other thing is pressure. You want to make sure you're applying it with a lot of pressure behind the trowel. You want the render to grip firmly to that scratch coat, and you want it to have a strong bond. The big part of having two coats of render is mainly for strength, and so you won't see the mortar joints in your brickwork. But with the more layers you have in a product, whether it's plywood or any plaster product really, the more layers you have, the stronger the product's going to be overall. So the scratch coat takes the abuse from the brickwork, and then the top coat is where you apply it to get it nice flat and then get the finish from it. So big pressure when you're applying the render, and then don't over trowel it. That's the other big tip. Like we said before, don't over trowel it, because what happens is if you do trowel your render too much, you'll pull the moisture from the back of the render, it comes to the front, and then it can actually fall off. It might not fall off on the same day, but what happens if you do start losing that bond, if the moisture is pulled to the front, then what happens, it can make the render go drummy, and by that it means it's not got a firm grip to the scratch coat below it. So always make sure you apply it, leave it, and then this is what you do, you rule it. This is a feather edge, basically straight edge, made from aluminium, and this is how you get your render flat. You don't do it with the trowel, you rule it flat. So what I'm doing is always render right to left. It's with plastering, it's left to right; rendering, it's right to left, and that's because you're working the gear into itself. But from that, you rule it. So I do a small section at a time, and we're going to go into ruling properly in a minute. So what we've done is just ruled small section, and then you follow on from yourself. And once it's ruled, you've got something to follow and you've got something to work to. It makes it a lot easier, and a lot easier to know that you've got a guide behind yourself. So by having that first section rendered, it's a lot easier then to apply the render, because you know which thickness you're working to. I have got beads at the top, but it doesn't matter that much because we're having coping stones. So all on top of these walls is going to be big coping stones planted. And again, it's probably the best way to make sure a dwarf wall like this is going to properly stay secure. It's not good practice really to have rendered tops. People do it, but it's best to have a coping stone or something on top that will disperse the water and allow it to run off. Because if you don't, it can get in behind the render. Once your water gets behind the render, then it's game over, because it'll just blow it as soon as you get a bit of ice or frost. So I was rendering in winter here, so what I've done is I have added an additive. It's called Feb Speed, and basically you add it to any cement or render compounds, and it'll just it'll speed the drying process up. Another tip: if you're working in winter, I always use it with all my rendering projects. I had about 250 ml worth, and it just allows you to float it and sponge it in decent time. Saying that, it was still dark when I finished it. You'll see at the end of this video that it was still dark regardless of how much you use. So another good practice when you're in winter, use some stuff like an accelerant, what you use in renders or cement based products, because it really does help push the job along. So again, just applying it. Nearly got this wall applied now, nearly got it on. So the big thing after the application is getting it flat. And you've had a sneak peek, but any straight edge will do. I often just bring a bucket near me. It saves me going to the bathtub every time. And you literally use the rule to get it nice and flat. It's not the trowel. It's not anything else. The main way you're going to get your walls flat is by ruling them flat. So what you do is you hold the straight edge or feather edge firmly with both hands, same equal distance either side of each other. And that way you've got full control when you're using it. And all you're doing is following again the work what you've put on before. And again, it's a lot easier once you've got one section applied, because you can just follow on from the work you've done previously. Big tip, always work horizontally as well as vertically. You've got to rule both ways. That's the only way you're going to get the wall completely flat. If you just do horizontally like this, for example, it might be flat horizontally, but you might have a big belly in the middle. You won't know where to pack it out, so you need to make sure you go vertically, and that'll let you know where the hollow areas are, whether it's in, you won't know it otherwise if you just go one way. So, yeah, like I said, both ways, and it's actually a bit of a dark art to ruling. It's not always the easiest way, but like I said, I like to rule the render when it's still wet. I know they do it differently, every person does it differently and every country does it differently, but I prefer to work the render when it's still got a bit of play in there. So whilst it's still wet, I like to rule it in sections like you've seen, small sections like that, and it just makes it a lot easier when you're pulling the render. It doesn't pull it, still keeps it in decent condition. I just find it's got better workability that way. What I'm doing here is, once you've ruled the areas, you get to see where the low spots are. So what you want to do is get your render and then apply it to where the low areas are, because like I said, we want to make this wall right. So once you've found out where the low spots are, directly apply it and then use your straight edge to rule them back out again. And this is how you fill all the areas. Going vertically and horizontally, you'll see where the gaps are. Literally just apply a bit more on top to where you've ruled, and then from there you can rule it flat. So it's not, the idea of it's not that hard. It's just tricky to use a straight edge to get a wall completely flat. You've got to think your hands have got to have full control of the length of that steel to make sure that you're getting that wall flat with basically a solid object and something that's essentially almost liquid. So it does take practice, but don't get disheartened. The more you'll do it, the easier it is. So now this is probably, if you've seen any of my videos, I love this tool. This is the Rafina Power Float, and for me this was a game changer in rendering. People think it's because it's a bit of a hack or it doesn't work. For me, not only do I think it's a better product in terms it's a bit faster, but I actually think it makes the render stronger using this. It really does compress the render a lot more than what your hand float can do. Yeah, for me, this is a real game changer. It really compresses the render. And basically, for anyone who's new, this is a float. Basically, what you do after floating, after you've ruled the render, you're going to have some areas where you've got a few ridges where the rule was left behind. What this does is takes away any high spots and fill in any lows. You can have a normal hand float, you don't need an electric one. This is, like I said, an electric power float. It's just got one trigger, one button, and it literally just oscillates and crushes the render into itself. So not only does it get the wall flatter, but it also makes it stronger because you're really compacting the render together. Good rule of thumb though is you want to give it time between applying and floating. You need time to allow the render to dry a little bit. So a good rule of thumb is if you can put your hand in the render and you're not you're putting pressure in but your finger's not leaving fingerprints in there, then generally that's a good time to get onto the floating stage. And like I said, if you apply a bit of pressure to the render and it holds its weight, it doesn't crush under itself, feel it's a bit stiff, then that's a perfect time to not only use a power float but also any hand float. And all you do is, this essentially, just in circular motions, it compresses the render into itself. If you were to do it with a hand float, you'd do a similar design, but you'd literally just hold the float flat to the render. There's no angle, you want the float to be completely flat on the render, and you just do circular motions, gently pushing the render into itself. But for me, this is one of the biggest hacks using this power float. I must admit, it's a bit heavy though. It has its drawbacks. For me, it's a bit of a heavy machine. After a while, you do feel it, but it's so much faster than using a normal hand float. It really does speed up the job. And for me, it does get the walls flatter, and I think it does make it a stronger product using this. So, big thing for me, power float is a real winner. There are other variations. You don't have to get the Rafina one. I think there's a lot cheaper ones on the market. I'll be honest, I've not looked properly, but there are cheaper ones. So you don't have to get the Rafina power float. You can get another one if you like. But again, they just do the job for me. As you can see, it is getting that wall nice and flat, and it is doing it quite fast. Big thing is the bottoms of the render. It's same with plastering. You want to make sure you haven't got any high spots. It's always easy to miss out the bottoms of any wall, really. But it's always good to make sure you've got the nice, flat, crisp finish all the way down. Now, this is actually a veranda where it's going to be a flat roof. It's going to have lead cut into the render, and it's going to go directly onto a fiberglass roof. So it's a nice little feature what they're doing here. So we don't have to worry about any rising damp. There's no DPM up here. This is on a rooftop. So yeah, it's rooftop. It's going to have lead cut into it, and the water's going to run directly onto a flat roof. So, like I said, we don't have to worry about any damp-proof membranes. But if you were to render on a normal build on the ground floor, what you want to do is, one, either put stop beads above the DPM damp course on the brickwork, and that just stops any render from penetrating from the floor to the top half of the wall. So that's a quick tip there. We won't go into that today, that's probably for another video, but like I said, just working our way down now, getting the wall flatter and flatter with the power float, working it into the very end, and like I said, making light work of it. Now the next stage, what we're going to be focused on is the sponging. This is the area where you start to really get that fine finishing render, that traditional finish. And all you do after you floated it, basically it's any little jumbo sponge will do. You can also use a sponge float. I just prefer to use a sponge, that's what I'm used to, it's what I prefer doing. So you have a bucket of water next to yourself, and all you're doing is in circular motions bringing the aggregate to the surface. I must admit, this is probably the easiest stage to rendering, but the big trick I will say is have a very, very light touch to it. If you've got a heavy hand when you're sponging, you'll see all the lines, you'll see the circular motions that you're working in. So what you want is to have a real light grip on the sponge, and when it starts getting clogged up, immediately clean it. So what I do is I tend to go over the whole wall once. Again, light touch, but I won't worry too much about cleaning the sponge as much. What I'm doing is getting the float marks out of the render. So I'll go over it once, not showing too much care for the finish straight away. Again, always having a light touch, but if there's a few lines, I won't be too worried about it straight away. And then what I do is really drench the sponge, get it really, really dry, and then go over it again. That whole section that I've done, I'll go back over it, but this time really getting that finish up to scratch. Again, light touch, and just gentle circular motions, bringing that aggregate to the surface, and just taking your time. You don't want to rush this stage, because it is easy to get a bad finish in rendering, even if your walls have been completely flattened and floated. If you've got someone who's heavy on the sponge, then you really will see that what happened, the sand will rub against itself and it'll create lines in the render. So the softer your touch is and the drier your sponge is, and if you constantly keep cleaning your sponge, that's what's going to allow you to get that best finish you can. is just taking your time, keeping your sponge clean, and making sure that you've got a soft touch. They're probably the three main factors to getting a good sponged finish in render. Like I said, it's nothing technical about it. Big tip, wear gloves. I had a lot of lime to my mixing rendering. I'll add a video actually in this little clip. Should just turn up now for the perfect mixing rendering. But yeah, I had a lot of lime, and the hydrated lime will eat your hands. It does burn your skin. Don't feel it at the time, but after a few days, if you don't use gloves, you'll see that it will start reaping havoc on your hands. So wear gloves as well. But this is literally all the best things that we can recommend to getting flat walls is applying it, ruling it flat, make sure you float it either with a hand float or a power float, and then sponging it to get that nice traditional finish in rendering. So that is, if you follow all these tricks, if you manage to get all this right, then you can get the perfect finish. Again, there's a few things it'll take. It's a bit tricky, like the ruling's a bit tricky at first, and the floating is a bit tricky at first. But if you can just get your head around these principles and really work at it, then there's no reason you won't do well in rendering. Thank you so much for watching. Here's the end results. Here's what they ended up looking like. Again, it was dark, but that's the other cruel tip of rendering, is always make sure you start early. Thanks for watching. It's Blaine Gray, Plastering For Beginners. I'll see you in the next one.